Hi, I'm Adam Drake from Mugen Seiki Racing, and today I'm going to do a promotional build for A-Main Hobbies of the new Mugen Seiki MBX8 Nitro Buggy. I don't know all the details. This is, again, going to be a promotion that's done through amainhobbies.com. They just reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to do the build. So along the way, I'll take a few pictures, maybe do a couple short videos, and even a couple how-tos throughout the build of the MBX8 Nitro Buggy. So here we have the HT differentials. In the MBX8, it comes with a new revised ring and pinion gear. These use straight cut gears, which really smooth out and make the drivetrain a lot more efficient. As far as building the diffs, it's really pretty simple. I mean, for the most part, you just build it as though the manual goes. One thing that is very critical with the HT diffs is the shims. I'm going to go over a little bit what I do as far as the shimming with my diffs, but one thing to know and understand is that the shimming can vary a little bit from diff to diff just because there's so many parts. So if the tolerance is a little bit different on one diff cup to the next, or a gear, or even the internal gears, you may need to adjust the shimming slightly. Normally, I start by testing the diffs with taking the larger internal shim that goes between the O-ring and the pin, and I move it to the outside of the diff. So you just go ahead and slide that over the out drive before you grease it and put it into the diff cup or the ring gear. As far as the smaller shims go, I like to start with using all of those shims behind the smaller internal gear and just check the mesh. If needed, you can remove those shims, but in most cases, if you move the larger shim to the outside, you'll want to go ahead and use the smaller shim behind the small gears. But again, you just have to kind of check it from diff to diff and make the adjustments accordingly. So now that I have the diffs assembled with the gears, like I said, I went ahead and started with the shims behind the small gears. I'll go ahead and install the gear side and then go ahead and just check the mesh. So I'll go ahead and do this before I put fluid in it, just because if you have to then adjust the shimming, it's not so messy. You can actually take it apart and not waste a bunch of fluid as well. One thing with my diffs, I normally run the Flashpoint aluminum cross pins just to reduce weight. They're actually still very durable and never a problem as far as durability or failure with them. It's just a way to reduce some weight and increase the acceleration. So I'll just go ahead and put all three of these together, and then go ahead and secure the screws, and I'll be back in a minute to check and show you the mesh. Okay, so now with all three diffs, we have the ring gears and spur gear secured. Now you'll want to just take and work the diff, and also when you're doing it, check it by pushing in as well as pulling out. And what you want to do is make sure that the mesh is just free and consistent all the way throughout, whether you push in, pull out, or even just spin it by hand. Now, with all three of these diffs, I put the large shim on the outside, so just moved it from between the O-ring and the pin to the outside, and then I used all of the internal small shims, and all of these diffs feel perfect. So that's usually the go-to shimming that I use. But again, if the mesh is a little bit tight, you may want to remove the small shims behind the smaller gears if needed. And pretty much once you check and you figure out the shimming for that gear set, and diff cup. As you rebuild your diff, you shouldn't need to like change or adjust the shimming. It should stay pretty consistent. Again, if you change the diff cup, it could vary a little bit, but for the most part, you should be good to go. But this is just something that you want to check, especially when building brand new HT differentials. And this will just make the diffs have a smoother, freer working, which will also help with consistency and traction. With the front upper shock mount screws, I like to use a little bit of blue thread lock. And obviously anytime you have a steel screw going into an aluminum part, it's good to use thread lock. But where it's super critical in this area is because you're taking the lock nut on and off, and if this isn't thread locked, a lot of times it'll loosen this screw. And if this screw or the upper shock mount gets loose at all, it can wiggle and it'll cause the screw to bend easier and potentially even break the screw or bend the shock mount. So I just like to use a little bit of blue thread lock for this, and in the long run it'll make your life a lot easier. For the front center universal, you'll just want to take a little bit of electric motor cleaner and spray out the threads of the universal, and then also wipe any of the oil or excess grease off the screw. Let this dry for maybe 30 seconds or so. It usually dries pretty quick. And then again, you can use blue thread lock, or for this I actually use a mix, a 50-50 mix of blue and red thread lock. But once this is dried, go ahead and secure the center universal to the pinion, and you can move on to the next step. So for shimming of the ring and pinion, I usually start with one of the included shims per side. Sometimes when the gearbox is brand new, it can be a little bit tight getting the diff in with a shim on each side. But from what I've found is that's been really consistent with the new ring and pinion, and once everything wears in, you can get the diff in and out pretty easy, even with the two shims, and it will reduce the amount of end play from side to side. From there, you can just go ahead and put the front diff cover on. One thing to notice though, when you put the front diff cover on, if you check the gear mesh, it's going to seem a little bit on the loose side, and it will only be that way until you secure the screws from the bottom that go through the chassis. Because when the screws go through the bottom, it actually clamps that case down and it will actually tighten up the mesh. So again, from what I've found, one shim on each side should work really good and be consistent from gearbox to gearbox. So here's a little tip for installing the sway bar ends, both the steel ball and the aluminum balls, and that is to use the ProTech RC shock shaft pliers. With the shock shaft pliers, there's also, it's a multi-tool basically, so it has a feature that allows you to install sway bar end balls as well as shock ends and everything super easy. The cool thing with this is not only does it make it easy to install them, but if you want to remove them, you can do that as well. So super simple, available now from ProTech RC, and just it'll make your wrenching and life much easier. So as you can see, we have the front clip pretty much all together. Just want to talk about a couple of the option parts that I use. In the kit, it comes with the carbon fiber upright mounts. I do run these, but what I do suggest having as a tuning option is the E2146 inline front uprights. The MBX8 comes with the trailing uprights, which will be a little bit more aggressive, have a little bit more steering mid-corner, but sometimes can be difficult to drive. So I definitely would suggest the 2146 inline uprights as a tuning option, as well as the 1mm front wheel hubs. It comes stock with the just 0 offset wheel hub, and the part number for the 1mm ones that I run in most conditions is E0241. So now I have the rear end almost complete on the new MBX8, and another cool feature that we have with the MBX8 is for the rear chassis brace. So we have these two plastic inserts that go in, and it will make the rear chassis brace similar to the old car, but to where it's super rigid, very stiff. Or you can remove these two plastic inserts and use a rubber fuel tank grommet. And what that will do, this is also included, but what that'll do is just allow a little bit more flex and a little bit more rear traction on bumpy, low grip conditions. Another thing I want to touch on is option parts for the rear of the vehicle. There really isn't any options that I feel are really necessary other than the 1mm rear hexes. If you're on a really dusty low grip track, the stock 0 offset wheel hexes will work just fine. But as the grip comes up, or if the track is a little choppy and you want to increase the stability of the rear end, you'll want to go to the 1mm rear hexes, and the part number for that is E0240. So here we have the clamping servo saver assembly, and a couple key points when building this is you want to make sure the screw that actually clamps this on, you use a little bit of thread lock, because if this screw comes out, obviously it's no longer clamping. The other thing is, in the manual it mentions that from this, the bottom of this surface to the actual servo saver nut, it should be adjusted to 2mm. I think that's a little bit too loose. I like to set mine at 4mm. With today's servos, they're super durable, and I would much rather have the precision steering versus having the servo saver loose and just kind of a really vague feel with the steering. The other thing is that I see happen quite a bit is with the steering rack. It's super important that these flathead screws are cleaned well. Use an electric motor cleaner or power shot from Habaco. And when you apply the thread lock, you want to put thread lock both on the screw as well as down in the threads of this little tube here. It's kind of a pain if this falls out, so it's one of those things you don't really change or have to take off often. So with this, I like to use a mix of blue and red thread lock. And again, clean the screw really good, clean the bushing, and then apply thread lock to the screw and the bushing before assembling. So I went ahead and finished the linkage, installed the wing mount, and now I'm just waiting to bleed the shocks. The kit comes with 500 weight oil front and rear with 8-hole 1.3 pistons. I recommend starting with 450 in the rear and the kit 550 oil in the front. And another thing that I forgot to mention earlier as far as options for the rear of the vehicle, once the drivetrain is fully broke in, I would recommend going to a 2.6 or possibly even a 2.5 rear sway bar. I think out of the box, the 2.7 will give it that kind of added support that's needed when the drivetrain is still new. But once the CVAs and the outdrives break in, going to a thinner rear bar will give a little bit more steering in the middle of the corner, as well as a little bit more grip on exit. But other than that, we're just gonna button up the finishing touches here, and we'll complete the build for the Mugen MBX8.